Good morning. The last couple of weeks, we dove into the topic of gambling, gaming, and with respect to how we as Christians should live our lives. And when I first started that, I thought it might be a two-part series. Now I'm in the third part, and my intent is to finish today. Quick recap, we did discuss a few principles. Whereas the Bible doesn't explicitly state, thou shalt not gamble, there are a number of principles by which we can be guided. And we've looked at what motivates gambling, greed, covetousness. We've looked at the addictive nature of gambling. We've looked at the places where the Bible authorizes us to obtain money, and we note that it leaves out gambling. It's not included. We can work for our money. We talked about the work ethic. We talked about bartering exchange. We've talked a little bit about accepting benevolence, but not gambling as a means to obtain financial security. We also looked at our influence upon others and upon ourselves. So today we're going to take a look at a couple more principles that can help guide us, and then take a brief overlook with what I might call a Q&A, just a few arguments for and against gambling in general. And my hope here is to take a sincere scriptural approach to this, that we can help guide our own lives and live as God intends for us to live. So the next principle is the principle of good stewardship. I don't have any fancy slides today, so you're not going to see any scriptures, but this would be a scripture passage to read. We're not going to read the whole passage, but I would write down in your notes or your Bible or wherever, Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 through 30. I encourage you to read the whole thing on your own time. We don't have time this morning. But we all know this passage as the parable of the talents. And remember, there were several servants. They were entrusted with money according to their own ability. One was given 5 talents, another 2, and then the third one given 1 talent. And when the master was away, they were given authority to do something with that money. And so the one who had received 5 talents had made an additional 5 when the master returned, and he was a good and faithful servant. And similarly, the servant that was given 2 talents went out and he did business as well, and he made 2 more talents. And so he was found faithful. But remember that third servant. He hid the money. Remember that? And then upon the master's return, he gave it just that one talent back. And he even said, I know you're a hard man. I know you reap where you don't sow. He's given his excuses. And then he said, so I hid the money. What was the master's reaction? In verse 26, his Lord answered and said unto him, Thou wicked and slothful servant, thou knewest that I reap where I sowed not, and gather where I have not strawed. So he was called a wicked and slothful servant. And it went even a little bit further. If you were to go down a couple more verses, verse 30, and this is, of course, Jesus is telling this parable, but he said here, And cast ye the unprofitable servant into outer darkness. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Well, the question I'd like to ask you this morning, which is worse? Which is worse? Is it worse to just hide the money and then give it back in full? There was no interest earned. I mean, he told him, you could at least put it in a bank and I could at least collect the interest on it. But no, he had just basically buried it and just gave him back the 1 talent. What do people who gamble do? People who gamble, they're betting, they're waging money in hopes of obtaining more money, but a lot of times they end up throwing it away, don't they? About a generation ago, about 70 years ago, to be more precise, and I won't give specifics or names, but there was a person who lived who was close to the family, and he had a gambling problem. And he preferred blackjack, or 21, as some people call it. And he was a truck driver. He traveled around a lot. And in one day, now granted, you're talking 70 years ago, he had both won and lost about $750 in one day. That's quite a bit of money in today's value. Well, several years later, he was found shot. He definitely died by a gunshot wound. They never found out if it was suicide or if it was somebody else had shot him, perhaps due to a gambling debt. He definitely lived on the edge, and he died a sorrowful way. And the answer is we'll never know the answer to how he actually died, and that can be a difficult thing for families to digest. What about the lotto? What are the odds of winning it? I think I checked a couple weeks ago, and the odds of winning the Idaho jackpot, because Idaho has a jackpot, it's a state-run facility, organization. I think the jackpot was in over 500 million or something like that. And the odds of winning it were 1 in almost 300 million. So if you go to buy your lotto ticket, I mean, maybe it's only $1 or $2 or $3. It's probably not much. But where's that money go? I mean, are you going to see any winnings from that? The lotto, or even going to a casino, in short, is pretty much a tax on people who refuse to acknowledge mathematics, or maybe have a lack of understanding on how to manage their finances, perhaps. You've heard the saying that the house always wins, right? Well, why is that? Why do people say that? It's a real thing. The house does always win in the long term. It's something called the house edge. You may have heard of this. The house edge, it's the odds advantage in the casino's favor, or it could be the lotto's favor. It doesn't matter which institution we're talking about. But particularly with respect to a casino, it represents the average gross profit that the casino reliably expects to make from a particular game. And so they offer all kinds of different games, right? So they know how much they're going to make on every one of those games because of this thing called the house edge. Let me explain. You've heard of roulette, right? Not Russian roulette. We're not going to play that. But this is a slower drain. House edge on roulette. You ever see there's like 36 little slots, that you could end up with, could be red or black, odd even numbers. Well, on a roulette table, you might see a couple of zeros on there too. That's where the house edge comes into play. Normally you think the numbers are from 1 to 36, so you have a 1 in 36 chance of winning. Actually, you don't. It's more like a 1 in 38 chance or 39 chance on winning, depending on how many zeros there are. Some have 1 0. I think places in Europe tend to have 1 0, but we in America tend to go 2 or 3. We like to live it up. Well, those double zeros give the house an edge of over 5% on that game. So long term, they expect to make 5.26%, so 5.26% on that game of roulette. That comes with the double zero. That's 5.26%. Do you know what that means? That means for every $1 million spent on that roulette table, the casino is making $50,000. So you get this. The casinos, they don't want to bankrupt you all in one sitting, right? They don't want to just have you completely bankrupt on your first time there. They're going to drain you slow over time. That's how that works. They want you to keep coming back and again and again. Why? Because they want a reliable expectation of profit. They want something that's going to keep giving to them. So, yeah, a person might get lucky short term. You might win some money short term. But the house always wins in the long term. It's statistics. You can't beat it. Now, however, people do know about the house edge, and still either they cannot do the math or they choose to try to refute it and still beat the odds nonetheless. Case scenario and point, perhaps you can go in with $100, you play for a few hours, and you only lose about $5. So you've only paid $5 to have a good time in net, right? Well, what really happens? Well, you know that roulette table, it spins kind of fast, and you can spin it quite a few times in an hour. So maybe you spin the wheel, say, 50 times in an hour, and perhaps instead of spending $100, you've spent $1,000. And instead of losing $5, you've only lost $50. Well, that's still 10 times more than you expected, and 10 times more that they got than you expected to give them. Casinos generally don't have any clocks or windows. The longer you play, the odds are greater that the house edge is going to catch up with you. First-time players are often surprised. Maybe they'll get offered free drinks. Alcoholic, of course. What's the cost of inebriation? It's certainly not going to help improve your betting judgment. You might be like, oh, wow, a free drink. Great, this is wonderful. A couple drinks later, maybe you're not quite so thoughtful in your wagers. It's not going to affect your judgment in a positive way. I was on a fire with a guy, and this is different from the fire guy that I talked to before a couple Sundays ago. This was a guy. He was also an addict to gambling, but in this case, this guy had spent over $100,000 to win a few thousand. And he was explaining to me about this. He was pretty proud of that fact, that he'd made a few $1,000s on gambling. But then when he revealed to me he had spent over $100,000 just to make that few thousand, he said, you know how hard that is to do that? So I can only imagine. He could not get off the topic about how he had to keep working and working and working. And I'm pretty sure it was to feed that thing that he had going on with gambling that was out of control. You see, this is how is gambling, in effect, good stewardship when, in the long run, the house always wins? Next idea, what about the fruits of gambling? What fruits does gambling produce? Luke chapter 6, verses 43 and 44. And you can write this one down. We don't have a lot of scriptures today, but there's a few. Jesus states there that no good tree bears bad fruit, nor again does a bad tree bear good fruit. For each tree is known by its own fruit. For figs are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor are grapes picked from a bramble bush. It can be confusing trying to figure out what's good versus bad fruit, especially if the fruit appears to be a little bit mixed, right? People will make arguments one way or the other, and what happens when you've got perhaps mixed fruits? Well, what does gambling do? What does gambling do for society? I've got a couple quotes here from PBS, and don't all cringe too quickly. PBS did cover the topic of gambling in several different ways, but I'll quote PBS here. As they stated that gambling, it increases taxes, overall job loss in a region, economic disruption of businesses, increased crime, and large social welfare costs. These are facts, as PBS concluded. And they further went on to say that for every dollar legalized, gambling interest indicate are being contributed in taxes. So every dollar that gambling contributes, it usually costs a taxpayer at least $3. So it's a 3-to-1 ratio against these institutes of gambling. I went to the Georgia Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities. They've got a website there, and I'm going to read off a few stats for you. $5 billion. That's the annual cost of a pathological or otherwise known as a problem gambler. That's how much are spent by them in the U.S. annually. 40% of those costs are related to drugs. $30 million. That is the amount stolen stolen. Mind you, gamblers get desperate, especially when they're at a loss in their life and they're trying to figure out a way to get money back. That's the amount stolen by less than 230 Gamblers Anonymous members. So you have Gamblers Anonymous members, they're reporting out what they have stolen. And 30 million. And then 45 million, a little bit larger number here. Do you know what that is? That's the cost to employees and employers, I should say, from people who are absent from their work because of gambling. 45 million, that's the cost to employers in the U.S. They also say that 90% of problem gamblers, they gambled with their paychecks and their life savings. So of these problem people, 90% of them have gambled with their own paychecks and with their life savings. They're on the edge of utter ruin financially. Of course, it's no surprise that divorce rates increase dramatically in households where gambling is a problem. It is quoted as one of the most expensive illnesses to society. And that 98% of problem gamblers are more likely to go to the ER for treatment for something. Perhaps drugs would be a common one, since 40% of costs are related to drug use. There are many different stories out there of people who have won the lotto, and a lot of times they'll try to give like a good story about somebody who's done something good with what they've won. The American Bankruptcy Institute, I'll quote them, they've estimated that anywhere from 30 to 70%, now I understand that's a wide range because it's a hard number to quantify, but anywhere from 30 to 70% of lotto winners end up bankrupt. They end up in bankruptcy court. Why is that? Well, a lot of them don't know how to manage money in the first place. They probably didn't understand the math. But there's more to it. When you win a lot, you want to give that away to people. You think about all your friends and your family that you want to help out. And then you think, wow, I could do all kinds of stuff with this. I can buy lavish things. And so they do. They buy things that are far outside their means. And before you know it, they've blown it. They spent it all away. And I won't bother to tell you all the myriad of stories, but there are a lot of stories about people who have won the lotto and have ended up bankrupt, told by themselves, and the lessons they've learned from that. There was one man, I think I remember, he ended up he was started off at McDonald's, and then he went back to McDonald's. But I think that was because he missed working with his friends. But it's a real thing. So let's take a little bit let's think about application for a moment. Kind of like the arguments for gambling and perhaps how we could respond as Christians, either in word or in deed. We've definitely heard people say, well, all life is a risk. This is just gambling, it's just another risk. And what about the stock market too? I mean, that's gambling. Well, is it? I would question that. You see, risk, yes, risk is one of the elements of gambling. Remember the definition of gambling. You have to have an arbitrary event with an uncertain outcome. You have to put a wager or a bet down upon a particular outcome which you don't really know. You're guessing at it. And then when you win or lose, but in this case when you win at the direct loss of somebody else. Or if you do lose, your loss goes to the winner. Those are the three main components of gambling. You see, risk is a part of that definition, but risk is not what makes gambling sinful. Now, you think of the stock market, for instance. You gain or lose based on a legitimate exchange of goods and services. When you gain, there is not necessarily a direct loss to somebody else. We're talking about business principles. And we talked about that last week and the week before with respect to Deuteronomy and how it explains how we can obtain money by doing fair business, not cheating each other. And we just saw in Matthew chapter 25 here the principle of investing in a bank or going out and investing your money to make more money. Those are completely legitimate ways to make money. The risk itself is not what makes it sinful. It is okay for your money to work for you in the case of the parable of the talents, where the master left certain stewards or servants in steward of some of his money. Well, it's just recreational. I don't know, maybe it's just bingo, maybe it's just a $3 scratch ticket. I control my spending, it's entertaining, and I only spend a little bit. A lot of people, we've talked about the fact that a lot of gamblers, a huge amount of the gamblers are poor and destitute, but not all are. Some are affluent, and they can spend from their excess. There's a couple of thoughts that we could go through here, and of course I can't cover every gamut or every scenario that there are in the world in just 20 minutes. But for example, if it's just a little bit, if it's just a bingo game, if it's just a scratch ticket, if it's just a little bit from the excess funds that I have, well, if it's just a little bit, why would we bother with the money part in the first place? Couldn't we, maybe I could just go over and you guys could come to my house, we could just play a game of cards. We don't need to involve money with it, do we? Jesus spoke to this principle a little bit too. In Matthew chapter 6, verse 20, what does he tell us there? He tells us to lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Does gambling do that? If you were sitting in a casino, if you're about to buy that scratch ticket, if Jesus was there with you, by your side, like if you could picture Jesus as a person in mortal form, like he was at one point upon this earth, would he engage in this activity with you? You might ask yourself that. Right after reading Matthew 6, verse 20, where he tells us to lay up yourselves treasures in heaven, could you picture Jesus engaging in a gambling activity with you? I think Jeff has used this analogy before, so I'm going to take some liberty here and use what Jeff has taught in it previously. But is a little porn okay? Pornography is not okay. Is a little cheating okay? No, that's wrong. If I'm married, right, is adultery okay? Would it be okay? I think Jeff's scenario was, 90% of the time we don't commit adultery, but 10% is, what if it's just 10%? Would that be okay? You see, the principle here that we're talking about is that it's not the amount that makes it sinful. It's the moral principles that come with it. Which we're talking about our motivation, the potential for addiction. Are we taking advantage of somebody? Are we a poor influence on somebody? Are we a poor influence on ourselves? Are we making somebody weak, or even weak to the point of stumbling? Are we being good stewards? Are we producing good works when we engage in these activities? Is it in line with the work ethic? Well, some might still say, well, good does come from it. It makes jobs. The Idaho Lotto states, and I quote, benefiting Idaho public schools and buildings. They do that. They do help. They give money. It's true. They also say play wise. But the house still wins, right? Not too long ago, maybe a couple years ago, the kids at their school, there's this event that's held once a year where any of the parents that want to get involved, they can meet up. It's sometime after one of the school days, and you scratch as many tickets as you can for $5, for 5 minutes, I'm sorry. So they have a pile of scratch tickets, and you scratch as many as you can in 5 minutes, and whatever you win, that money goes to your school. And so it's this thing that the school does every year. I've never been to one. I've not seen the pile of scratch tickets. I've never tried to go as fast as I could in 5 minutes. But yeah, isn't that a good thing? Well, gambling uses good things to sugarcoat what is really going on. the good things certainly are far less than the bad. So what fruit is this tree bearing? Do you remember the 3-to-1 taxpayer cost ratio? The cost to society is 3 times the amount of the profit that gambling makes. An individual, his name is Professor Jack Vanderslick, back in 1990, he stated that gambling produces no product, no new wealth, and so it makes no genuine contribution to economic development. You can also go into this thing called neighborhood scout, but the scout is kind of got a slant, making it almost look like a Q. I don't know if Paul's ever seen this. He does a lot of real estate type of stuff, looking at the best places to live. I don't know if you've ever looked at New Jersey, but in New Jersey, the chance of becoming a victim of a violent crime is 1 in 452. So out of every 452 people, 1 is likely to become a victim of some sort of violent crime. Now, you know Atlantic City is in New Jersey too. All you got to do is go to Atlantic City. It's also a popular gaming place, right? The chances go from 1 in 452 to 1 in 53. So we're in a gambling area, and all of a sudden, the odds just skyrocketed as far as becoming a victim of a violent crime. Well, there is a Thomas R. O'Brien back in the 80s. He was a former director of gaming enforcement for New Jersey. He stated that, he's talking about gambling, he's talking about the product of gambling. That product, it is not entertainment, it's not recreation or leisure. It's really adrenaline. It's a biological substance capable of producing excitement, highs, and generated usually by anticipation or expectation of a future event, especially when the outcome of that event is in doubt. And according to Professor William Thompson, University of Nevada, Las Vegas, he called it a mind-altering drug. Well, some might say, well, the Bible has this thing called casting lots. What about casting lots? That's gambling? No, I'm sorry, it's not. The Bible does reference to casting lots a number of times, both Old and New Testament. It's throughout the Bible. What they would have is sometimes it would be sticks, stones, perhaps pieces of pottery. You could draw them or you could throw them. And the idea would be to make a decision. They're trying to discern a decision or allocate responsibility. Remember the lots for the replacement to Judas as an apostle? The whole premise on casting lots in the Bible is that the outcome is governed by divine providence. So there's no wager, there's no money involved here. There's simply just, it's almost like you're rolling the dice to ask for a decision. Probably the best thing I can think of, modern day, you ever see on the football field, they'll flip a coin, heads or tails, who gets to go first kind of thing on the sports game. It's kind of like that, but much more serious. You see, I think the easiest way to describe the intent is that the Lord's will be done. Lots were sometimes employed as a tool to try to determine what divine guidance might be. It underscores a dependency upon God. It's very different and certainly does not meet in the definition of gambling. Write down Proverbs 16, verse 33. It reads there that the lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. So culturally speaking, when people cast lots in the Bible, they were completely dependent upon the Lord, and they were just trying to come up with a providential decision on something. It has nothing to do with gambling. But some might still tell you, hey, you still haven't found an actual scripture that's specific against gambling. My first response would be, I don't need to. I've got a half a dozen or so principles that are very simple that speak to it. But You could read Proverbs 13, verse 11. It says there, and I'm in Proverbs because Proverbs explains things very simply, very clearly. Proverbs 13, verse 11. Wealth gotten by vanity shall be diminished, but he that gathereth by labor shall have increase. What is vanity? By definition, it means nothing. It's emptiness. It's money that's gained hastily, such as a quick get quick rich scheme, or perhaps gambling where you're trying to get a lot of money quick. It's fraud. It's dishonest gain. That's what vanity means. It's for self. It has nothing to do with God or anyone else. It's just purely for self. So if there's any scripture that could speak very directly to it, I would say Proverbs 13, verse 11, states it quite clearly. Wealth gotten by vanity shall be diminished. It shall go away. But he that gathereth by labor, real work, shall have increase. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 10. It reads there that we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may be recompensed for his deeds in the body, that is, according to what we have done, whether good or bad. That's New King James Version. Do we have good motivation when we are doing something? And we're talking not just gambling here. We're talking as Christians living our lives. Is there good motivation behind it? Are we or others that we are around prone to addiction? Or maybe we're potentially causing them to become weak, even perhaps to the point of stumbling? Are we a good influence on others? Or are we taking advantage on them? Are we truly good financial stewards? Is our work ethic sound? What fruits are we bearing? Are we bearing anything really good? Are we remaining diligent, vigilant in our faith? Many, unfortunately, and I'm saying this almost pun-like, but we are still gambling with our souls. Many are gambling with their souls at the risk of eternal consequences. There are people who deny the afterlife. They avoid the teachings of God. And what do? They replace it with their own clever wisdom. Remember, the house always wins. The math is unwavering, and it is unforgiving. Let me read it one more passage for you. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 15. But if I tarry long, that thou mayest know how thou oughtest to behave thyself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and ground of the truth. There are two houses. There are houses with sin, and then there is the house of God. The houses of sin are not forgiving, but God is. God's house is always the true reality. You see, it says there, the pillar and ground of the truth. There is only one reality, and that's in God's house. Rather than wagering our souls in some lost cause that will eventually dissipate into nothing, let's invest ourselves and everything that we are in the one thing that actually does pay dividends, eternal dividends. If there are any of you among our group this morning who have a need, whether it is to become a Christian through the watery grave of baptism and a faithful life thereafter, or if there's anything that we can pray for you or help you with in any way, please come forward as we stand and sing.